Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first Praxis Roundtable, hosted by the World Bank in partnership with the Diplomat magazine. My name's Ian Gerard, and I'm editor of the Diplomat. Today we're launching a series of debates and discussions dedicated to analysing key international development issues. This is going to be a PowerPoint-free zone. Instead of lecturing, we're encouraging an open exchange of ideas, both from and between our expert panellists and also our audience. The word praxis means practice, particularly in the context of distinguishing practice from theory. And certainly one of our goals over the next hour and indeed the coming months is to highlight or suggest or perhaps even discover positive, practical solutions to the issues in question. Today's topic is migration and international development. Migration is, of course, a multidimensional subject inextricably linked to the biggest global concerns, including climate change, national and international security, and the spread of infectious diseases. We're going to be touching on a number of smaller subjects within the broad migration issue, including skilled migration, forced migration, unskilled migration. And we're also going to be looking at the issue of migration and remittances. Remittances being the money sent home by migrant workers to support their families. It's an issue that offers a new perspective to traditional views of international development. The World Bank actually estimates that there are 200 million migrants worldwide. That's about 3% of the total global population. In case you haven't already guessed from the accent, I'm actually one of them. I'm part of the internationally mobile workforce myself. In my case, I left England because, well, my Australian wife pretty much insisted on it. But many migrants have no choice but to seek work overseas so that they can earn money and they can send wages back home to support their families. Officially recorded remittances were estimated at $238 billion US in 2008, which is almost 3 times official aid figures. Remittances are also the largest source of foreign exchange earnings in many developing countries, accounting for 40% of GDP for the likes of Tajikistan, Tonga, Honduras and Moldova. So it's easy to see why remittances have been called a lifeline for the poor, given those statistics. And joining me to discuss this issue and others, on my right is Manjulia Luthria, who's Senior Economist for the World Bank. We also have Ted Wolfers, who's Professor of History and Politics at the University of Wollongong. On my left now we have journalist and researcher Nick McClellan, and on my far left is Mark Getchell, who's Regional Representative for the International Organisation for Migration. Once we've heard from each of our panellists, there's going to be time for comments and questions from the audience. But I'm going to start off with Manjula. In August last year, the Australian government announced the Pacific Seasonal Worker Pilot Scheme as a means of better harnessing remittances through increased labour mobility. Under the scheme, up to 2,500 workers from Kiribati, Papua New Guinea, Tonga and Vanuatu can come to Australia to work in the horticultural industry for up to 7 months a year. So Manjula, I'd like to know, how important are labour programmes overall, and particularly, how important is labour market mobility for small and fragile island states?
Thank you, Ian.
And may I also welcome you all to this roundtable. I'm glad you mentioned the link between migration and development. I tend to believe that actually, while there are several studies that attempt to map this link, it's actually quite simple. Migration is development, because after all, a migrant moves and tends to double or quadruple his or her income, better job prospects, not just for the person who's moving, but very often for the community and even sometimes for the countries that they have left. This particular, it's most easy to think of this sort of development channel as being through remittances. I tend to think of it as much more than just the money. I think there used to be, I think, this great fear of people leaving, sort of in the 70s and 80s referred to as brain drain. I think soon that sort of thinking evolved into, well, if they don't leave, maybe it's going to be brain down the drain. And I think now we're much more in an era where we understand, I think, and appreciate much better the idea that this is maybe about brain circulation. People are not like commodities, like a bag of gold that's shipped out and it's gone forever. Through knowledge networks and connections, people are actually able to contribute both to their host and their home countries. That being said, the problem is that I think migration isn't pro-poor. By that I mean that the skilled can move quite easily, and I suspect they will move even more easily as the global hunt for talent intensifies. The unskilled, however, the ones without the specialized sets of skills, are likely to stay trapped. Now this is where it becomes hugely important, I think, in the context of fragile states. And I shouldn't generalize. I know someone said that all happy families are happy for the same reason, but all unhappy families have their own distinct set of problems. So I wouldn't generalize across fragile states, but the ones in Australia's neighborhood are small remote island nations looking for some way to globally integrate. And there aren't many ways for them to do that, but the labor market is one way for them to be able to create job opportunities, create more economic stability, I would say even perhaps greater social stability, and even strengthen some of the sort of the demands, strengthen the demand for governance in the course of that. So who's going to take them? Who's going to take the unskilled, the poor? It's not an easy answer. We know that the appetite in rich countries isn't huge for a lot of real and perceived sets of costs that are associated with the movement of unskilled. One way to go about that in terms of solutions is to think of a program where the poor can earn abroad and consume at home, where they're allowed temporary, limited access to the labor market of usually a country in a developed labor market in the region. Now, it can be designed to be win-win, but it's much easier said than done. And I think that's the stage we are at now, where I think there needs to be much greater focus and attention on designing such schemes so they actually are win-win, and there are plenty of good and bad lessons to learn from, experiences to learn from. But equally, I think enough attention needs to be devoted to how to implement such schemes. And I think this is non-trivial, because thus far the arrangements for migration don't involve a lot of attention necessarily to implementation. It just happens, largely because the skilled move. When the unskilled are going to move, I think it's really important to start paying attention, in my view, to what I think of as a fundamental mismatch in incentives between rich and poor countries. The very people that the rich countries want to welcome with the red carpet are the ones that, if the poor countries could, and they do try to, they're the ones they'd like to hold on to. The very countries that the poor wouldn't mind shipping out and not seeing again are precisely the ones that the rich countries would like to ensure do not overstay, because there are, as I said, real and perceived social costs associated with it. So I think therein lies the problem. There is no way, in my opinion, that temporary work programs can work without something for which there isn't even a sound global architecture in place right now. And that is to ensure cooperation between sending and receiving countries. As is always the case, whenever there is a market failure, in this case a market failure of capacity and trust, it fundamentally comes down to trust. And that's why these are, I think such schemes are very unlikely to be necessarily global schemes. They're likely to be regional, even more so they're likely to be bilateral, where trust needs to be built in. Without that trust, and without that cooperation between host and destination governments, between employers and employees, I don't see how these schemes can work. And if that doesn't happen, what's going to land up, what we will likely see is suboptimal migration. And if we really care about the bottom billion, we, I think, have to start caring seriously about including migration as an option for the bottom billion to be able to integrate with the world. So I want to end on that basic point of cooperation between sending and receiving countries, for which there isn't necessarily an architecture in place, but one that I think is desperately needed.
Thanks very much, Nigel. Nick McClellan, I'm going to turn to you now. You've lived and worked in the Pacific Islands, and last year you co-authored a report for Swinburne's University Institute for Social Research, in which you said, long stints away for migrant seasonal workers may not be in the best interest of the worker's family. So, given that, are labour programmes that require workers to spend months away really the answer here, or are there other possibilities that should be considered?
I think the discussion around a seasonal worker program, as we've seen in countries like Canada, New Zealand and now Australia with the pilot program that the Rudd government has announced, have to address these questions. There is a fundamental difference between permanent migration and temporary labour schemes. Permanent migrant obviously takes on the rights of citizenship and the protections of citizenship. For a temporary worker, there's a structural imbalance. And so the issue that Manjula raised about the need for social protection is pretty central to any seasonal worker scheme. Indeed, that's being echoed by Pacific governments. When the scheme was announced last year, Papua New Guinea's Agriculture Minister stated, and I quote, "First, we'd like to see our workers belong to a trade union in Australia, because we would receive some protection from exploitation if they become trade unionists." Now, some employers in Australia don't see that as part of the package, and yet, so this question of social protection within Australia is pretty central to the design of seasonal worker schemes. But as you mentioned, there's also the issues of both the costs and benefits in the sending countries. And as you mentioned in our research, we've talked about these potential social costs. The experience of New Zealand over the last year, and certainly Canada over some decades, has shown that there are very clear benefits from seasonal worker schemes in terms of the transfer of remittances, skills and knowledge, the opportunity for businesses, small businesses growing and so on. But there are hidden social costs, and some of that's at the household level, as you suggest. The impact of a parent being away for 6 or 7 months of the year, what does that mean for children's education, for the autonomy of women in the home, for elderly women in the village? And there are social costs, therefore, associated with workers being away for half the year in another country. Who bears those costs? Is it simply at the level of the household or community? Are there costs for local governments in terms of welfare costs in the sending countries? So what I'm suggesting is that there are broader issues than simply the workplace relationship between employer and worker. As Australia is designing a pilot scheme for seasonal workers, there's been a lot of focus on social protection for Pacific Island workers coming to Australia, quite rightly, to ensure that they receive wages and conditions comparable to Australian workers, that there's no disadvantage for Australian workers in employment opportunities, that issues like occupational health and safety are taken up. Those social protection issues are pretty central to making these schemes work. But I think we need to look broader about how does this fit into the primary focus of development within neighbouring Pacific communities, to ensure that these sort of schemes enhance rather than challenge community development. And that involves drawing in a broader range of players than simply the employer and the worker. There's a role for bodies like AusAid, the Australian government's aid agency, in linking in these sort of seasonal work schemes with broader programs of community development, so that workers coming from a particular region in the Pacific, the remittances that are flowing back to that community can be enhanced to focus not only on improving household conditions, paying school fees, but also looking at community development around water, around sanitation, around small business. How we integrate all the players that need to make that happen is a real challenge. And I think New Zealand's found that over the first year or so of the operation of their recognised seasonal employer scheme.
Just one follow-up for you then, Nick. You talked about John Hickey from Papua New Guinea expressing concern about migrant workers being exploited by employers. Is that a legitimate concern, do you think?
It's a concern that's been raised certainly with the New Zealand and the Australian trade union movement, that schemes like this might be used to undercut wages and conditions for Australian workers. And there's a lot of discussion in both New Zealand and Australia about how schemes like this can be designed to protect wages and conditions, both for Australian workers and for the overseas workers. In the longer term, there's real questions about labour rights within the Pacific. For example, no member of the Pacific Island Forum, not Australia and New Zealand as well, has signed key ILO conventions on the rights of migrant workers. And if these pilot schemes in Australia and New Zealand over time blossom into much bigger programs, I think these issues will come up. How do programs of seasonal work and greater labour mobility within a regional context come together around programs for decent work? How does it fit into industry policy in the Pacific, particularly as forum member countries are currently talking about a regional free trade agreement, PACER Plus, which is going to see massive restructuring in island economies? How does it fit into questions around education, skills and vocational training, That's a debate we're having in Australia with the current government pledging a greater investment in education through the so-called education revolution. Can we see the same thing in neighbouring Pacific countries where seasonal work schemes are tied much closer to vocational and trades training so that there are real opportunities for skills development coming out of this rather than simply seeing islanders as a cheap labour force? That involves coordination between government departments, and that's a real challenge sometimes, speaking frankly.
Lovely, thanks Nick. Ted Wolf, as we're talking about Papua New Guinea, I'll move on to you as an advisor to the Papua New Guinea government and a specialist on relations between advanced industrial and less developed countries. Helen Hughes from the Centre of Independent Studies has argued that remittances cannot solve the region's problems unless its governments commit to legal and economic reforms that generate jobs and investment. Can I ask you, is that a fair call with regards to countries like PNG or the Solomon Islands?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there's quite a debate about the developmental impacts of remittances, with some of the international agencies much more confident about that than people like Helen Hughes and Dr. Sodi, who've been very critical of it. But I think there's a range of related questions that need to be looked at. I mean, the first thing is that in many Pacific communities, and certainly in Papua New Guinea, people are increasingly being forced to pay school fees, being forced to pay for hospital services and so on. If people are going abroad to work and using the money for school fees, are we going to call that development or not? I would have thought that was an investment in the future. So I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to it. But I also don't think it would be very difficult to work out strategies that provided developmental benefits. We seem, when it comes to Pacific Islands labour, to say they can come for a limited period and then they must go. Whereas with almost every other community we've dealt with in Australia, historically, if there's been a labour shortage, we've recruited migrants. Now, it's the wrong time to be arguing about migration policy at the macro level in Australia, probably. But there may be ways that you can build benefits even into these schemes that haven't been considered. The one that strikes me most obviously is, okay, we'll bring unskilled or semi-skilled people here. Firstly, we maybe should look at the areas they come from. Are there areas which are particularly conflicted, particularly difficult for young people growing up, where there's some advantage in offering them opportunities that otherwise wouldn't exist? One would need to be very careful about that, but there may well be areas, and I've talked to people who believe there are, and that there's evidence to suggest that that may be a way of dealing with much wider social problems in some Pacific Island settings. When they do come, why is it that we're not looking at options like on-the-job training outside the agricultural sector? Why aren't we saying to people, it may not be practical during the fruit picking season, I don't know. If the hours are too long, going to tech at night's probably not an option. But why must they get on the boat at the absolute end of it instead of staying on and doing a job attachment somewhere and acquiring computer skills or office skills? I'm talking about, ultimately, we can be talking about quite sophisticated training, but I'm talking about very basic skills that many people in the Pacific have difficulty acquiring, that can be acquired by on-the-job training or in local communities, and where there is a developmental benefit that they can take back with them. And that could go all the way through from language skills to office skills, to all sorts of quite rudimentary things where businesses are complaining in the region that people don't have those skills when they front up for employment. I think at the same time we need to look very carefully at the growing movement of educated people out of the region. At one level, nobody cares very much. Its opportunities, its experience, in some cases it's marvellous because it adds to the prestige of the region. When I look at some of the Papua New Guineans now flying aircraft in the Middle East, being senior medicos in Australia, at the head of major multinational corporations in one case, or major, in the World Bank Group, one of the most senior people is in fact a Papua New Guinean lady who holds a very senior position. I think that's a wonderful role model, something we shouldn't be criticising in any way at all. At the same time, in countries where the actual number of doctors is so small and access to services are so small, maybe we need to look at different strategies which encourage people to stay or to come. And I think there's some very simple ones. One strategy that the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea has talked about, and Air Guinea has actually begun to implement, is to put their pilots on equal salary with expatriates. Now, that poses all sorts of longer-term economic problems I'm sure Professor Hughes and others would never approve of. But that's one way forward. But I'm also struck that when educated Papua New Guineans I know want to go overseas to university or other appointments, the institutions from which they come make them resign. They don't have the benefits I've had in my life of saying, why don't you go and do that and bring back the skills to the institution you've left? In other words, I think there's a very simple set of internal reforms that might free things up. I think if we had proper exchange schemes that allowed people to go abroad for a period and to come home, there'd be benefit in that. I think schemes that allowed young graduates, for example, to have access to the credit they need or the resources they need to set up would be another way of keeping them or attracting them back. I think we're treating all of this as if they're essentially economic problems, as if they're zero-sum problems, as if there's nothing we can do. And I think part of it is also that we need to, particularly if we are serious about encouraging people to come here, is we need to look at what we're doing in Australia. If some of the problems that have already arisen on major projects in Papua New Guinea are cultural problems where the employer doesn't know that the way the Melanesians, for example, bathe themselves isn't the way that people in some Asian countries do. And it leads to problems on a labour project which are very easily solved by learning about the country in which you're working or from which your labour has come. Shouting in English at someone and believing you're communicating in Pidgin isn't quite the same thing, but it's very common. Maybe we need to do some more education in Australia in the areas to which people are going to explain some of the customs, some of the values they have, maybe to explain that some of them do speak different languages, and maybe to set up community networks, not simply using the churches as a kind of unpaid adjunct to the state, but actually connecting with other parts of the community. We need to look perhaps very carefully about whether there's some incentive we should offer for men to come with their wives rather than on their own. I'm not pushing any of these particular ideas. I have different views on some of these options, but it does seem to me that we're not really looking at them. And there are some very simple practicalities. You try and buy basic Papua New Guinean foodstuffs anywhere in Australia at a reasonable price, and you might be lucky in Cairns, but I will exclude the reasonable price part. That's the first thing. People are going to have trouble when they come here doing the things that migrant communities habitually do when they move. We are going to have to educate doctors to look for diseases they don't normally look for in Australia, or they won't be able to help these people when they get sick. And we're going to have to find, and this is going to sound silly, but you try and take a Melanesian to a hairdresser or a barber in New South Wales. Simple things like that which we need to look at. So I'm saying we should open up the debate beyond this simple input-output model, there or here model, economic measures model, and view development in a much more comprehensive way, which is, I think, consistent with what my colleagues have been saying.
That's lovely, thanks, Ted. It's interesting that you're playing up or stressing the economic side of things. Backs up with what Nick was saying about social costs. And so we'll move to Mark Getchell now of the International Organisation for Migration. Obviously, this is we're living through a credit crunch, a global financial crisis, whatever you want to call it. What sort of impact does that have on the whole issue of migration?
Thank you, Ian. I was asked to quickly go over what IOM is and what it does, and so very quickly, formed in 1951 outside the UN system, IOM has become the lead agency dealing specifically with migration issues. Its rally cry is managing migration for the benefit of all. And it bases this on the premise that humane and orderly migration is beneficial to society and the migrants themselves. What do? We work to promote humane and orderly migration, obviously, and promote also international dialogue and cooperation on migration. We are often finding and working with governments and migrants to find solutions to migration problems and implementing those solutions as well as providing basic humanitarian assistance to migrants in need, which involves refugees, which involves displaced persons or victims of trafficking. So with this as a backdrop, I was then asked to toss out some, they were called nuggets, I guess, so nuggets or factoids that will hopefully prompt some discussion. And the first nugget that I toss out there basically for Australia is the fact that Australia has 20% of its population that is not born here, that are migrants. And this, for any country in the world with a population of 20 million or more, this is the largest percentage of migrant population globally. Australia and New Zealand are among those handful of countries around the world that have a robust and forward-looking migration practice. And in this region, of course, they are the main destination for migrants, and they are the receiving countries for refugees and asylum seekers. We move on to nugget number 3, which is the fact, as has been mentioned, skilled migration in Australia has sort of taken off. The graph is on the upward trend. It has more than doubled since the year 2000. In the past, it was the family reunification numbers that would, the in-migration to Australia, that would really feed and fuel the demographics of the country. Now, the skilled migration movements have really taken over. The numbers quickly are 108,000 last year, more than 108,000 versus 50,000 family migration, and we're looking at potentially 133,000 in this year to come. A local trend, again, it sort of ties in with what's being said here for Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia. All of the data looks at, when you look at the job creation versus population numbers, it points towards an oversupply in this region of labor, starting very soon and from 2015. And with the PNG, which has been mentioned, the main leading the pack in this as far as oversupply of labor. So with this as a backdrop, I move into the topic of the economic crisis. And what normally happens during economic crises, and historically we can look and see that countries sort of have often a knee-jerk reaction to point the finger of blame at migrants and to say, oh, these migrants, these non-citizens are coming in, they're taking jobs away from us. And with ILO announcing figures that of upwards of 20 million jobs could be lost this coming year, this is a great potential reaction of countries around the world. I'm not saying Australia alone. All countries need to deal with this. And so there is a school of thought that is saying that Australia, given the fact that it has recognized gaps, it has specific needs that are known, that this potentially could be actually a huge benefit to Australia if it maintains its current skilled migration programs and migration trends as they are. However, in any case, policymakers always need to balance public opinion, which translates into approval ratings and votes, need to balance that with these realities and the factual basis and research and historical data that says that migration is indeed a very positive influence. IOM's constitution itself recognizes the positive link between international, with social, economic, and cultural development, and migration. It is a positive thing. However, it gets a bad reputation, particularly in times of economic crises, as is now unfolding. And the normal knee-jerk reaction is to put up further barriers to migration, to restrict migration, and the results of this are, as has been seen in the past, the increase in irregular forms of migration, and the migrants continue to move, but they now need to move with the help of people smugglers, people traffickers, and there you have again the problem of protection and exploitation of migrants. So I would just end, of course, given IOM's position and positive position on migration, orderly and humane migration, I would end by saying that when the barriers go up at any time, the barriers to migration go up, then the benefits of migration come down. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mark. So now we've had an opportunity to hear from all of our four panellists. It's the opportunity to put the spotlight out onto the audience. If anyone has any questions for a particular panellist, or if any of you want to make a general point regarding the topics that we'll be looking at, if you could raise your hand, and then when I call on you, if you could stand, a microphone's going to be brought around so you can make your voice heard. If you could stand, give us your name, the organisation that you're from, and ask your question. So I'll open it up to you. Yes, please.
Yeah, my name's Archie Law. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at AusCare, which is a non-government organisation. I've just got a couple of issues to raise concerning development outcomes for the developing country, as much as there might be for Australia in these sorts of issues, particularly remittances. The work we've done, the research that's been done, we're finding really that the problem really is equity as much as anything, and there's certainly no doubt that many communities benefit from migration remittances, but how many of the poorest communities actually benefit from that, I think, which is a point that was raised by Manjula. Also, how many countries really do benefit from remittances? I mean, there's countries that we all know, such as India, China, Mexico, Nigeria, that benefit quite handsomely from this, but how widespread is that? And certainly appreciate the thoughts of the panel on that. And then also just to raise the issue of how does a state actually use the remittances to enable a fair and equitable distribution of that income, and then that raises the issue of taxation. I think if we add up the total sum of official development assistance, if we include foreign direct investment and remittances, we get somewhere near around 800 billion globally in less developed countries. We look at the amount that less developed countries lose as a result of uncaptured taxation revenue, that's about 800 billion as well. And I'd just be interested in thoughts on that subject as well. Thanks.
Lovely, thanks for that. Manjula, did you want to kick off with the reply for that?
Thank you. In terms of which countries benefit, obviously in addition to the ones you mentioned, which are in absolute terms the largest receivers of remittances, India, Mexico, Philippines. In terms of percentage of GDP, though, you might find that the ones where remittances are the largest portion of GDP are actually right here in this region. Tonga is one where at least 40% of GDP is remittances, and I dare say that's a huge underestimate, simply because not all remittances are actually sent through the formal channels. And in fact, given how high the costs are of sending remittances into the Pacific, it's no surprise at all that people try very creative ways of sending money home, including in envelopes. So our estimate is that that's a huge underestimate. It could be easily, twice that. Samoa, another country where it's about 25% of GDP. Vanuatu, interestingly, only recently has actually started participating in the Melanesia had practically no labour mobility until the seasonal worker program came out. And just in the last 15 months or so, where Vanuatu has had a good run in terms of being able to place people into New Zealand, we're seeing that it's the second largest foreign exchange earner, about, I think, to overtake tourism very soon. So we have huge remittance receivers in terms of proportion of their income in this region. The issue of equity that you raised, I think, is spot on. How do you get more people to partake in this? And the answer, I think, is you improve equity of participation in mobility. That's the only way you can actually have more people being able to benefit from remittances. And until recently, and for that matter, these countries, Tonga and Samoa, which have had traditionally very high amount of remittances, have got that from permanent and skilled out-migration. The temporary movement of unskilled people is a very new thing in this region, barring perhaps the Kiribati experience with seafarers. So as the poor move, as more people have an opportunity to move, we will see the equity issues being addressed. In fact, again, just referring back to the experience of about 15 months or so in New Zealand, we've seen that some of the poorest villages in Vanuatu are starting to be transformed. There are schools that finally have roofs and textbooks. And there are people who are actually coming back from New Zealand, having spent about 4 to 6 months, coming back asking really interesting questions about why do I pay so much for a telephone call when I'm back in Vanuatu when I paid about 1/10 for the similar duration when I was in New Zealand. So you're starting to see the sorts of questions, which is what I was referring to earlier. It goes well beyond the money, and you're starting to see an interest in broader sort of governance issues as well.
Nick, did you want to add to the issues of equity?
I think one central question to this is about recruitment and the range of players who are involved in recruiting overseas workers. Because what we've seen in the Pacific is examples where lack of regulation of the recruitment industry has caused problems. For example, Fijian workers going to Iraq has led to a whole range of social consequences. Private military contractors recruiting for the Iraq War has seen all sorts of social problems. And I think what we've seen with the New Zealand experience and coming up with the Australian pilot scheme is a focus on this question of recruitment and ensuring that equity questions are built into that. For example, Tonga's recruitment of seasonal workers for the New Zealand RSE scheme has involved a conscious policy of targeting each island group, particularly poorer communities. It's been run by the Central Ministry of Labour, who've created a pool of recruits to ensure that a range of people are involved. There's been a focus on getting women to apply. And this raises questions about how recruitment's done, whether it's left to private recruiters or employers to do the work, or whether there's some social policy related to this to ensure that a whole range of people get opportunities to go. And we've seen some quite interesting examples in Tonga and Vanuatu of local communities organising so that when workers come back with remittances, it can flow onto community initiatives. In Vanuatu, there's a development corporation in some of the Northern Islands that's ensuring that some of the remittances go back into a microcredit scheme for women. So although it's largely men who are going to New Zealand for the seasonal work, some of the money's flowing back to women in the community. So that involves a level of intervention that's really important, not just leaving it to free market forces.
Lovely. Any more questions, please? Yes.
I'd just like to ask about the effect of the global financial crisis on remittances. And I'm thinking that if you assume that a lot of migrants are involved in for example, the construction industry in the United States, whether there's any evidence to date of whether remittances flowing to the Pacific region are starting to fall back somewhat.
Ted, is there something you'd like to comment on?
Maybe if I could just address both questions a bit at once. It seems to me that the question of equity is much more complicated, and that therefore the likely effects of the financial crisis are much more complicated than we've got on the table and is frequently recognised. What is a poor person in Melanesia? Is it a person who's moved from the village, who's living on a minimal income and barely able to survive? A person in a village which, for environmental reasons or because people are moving out, no longer has or because of overfishing or something, no longer has a viable agricultural base, and therefore villages are becoming dependent upon urban incomes? Or is it a person in an area which has good soil, a vibrant agricultural industry, and maybe isn't involved heavily, or might be involved heavily, in the cash economy? It seems to me that these issues are very difficult indeed, and if we don't disentangle them, with many people, migration is a two-step process. They left the village. Sometimes the village no longer can sustain itself. I'm watching remittances go back to villages in Melanesia from the urban areas, and whereas 10 or 15 years ago it was luxuries that were going, or the extra rice you wouldn't normally have, now it is basic supplies. That's in addition to school fees and medical costs. If we don't recognise that, we're going to have a real problem in making this work. And to return to the global financial crisis, at the moment it seems to be having relatively positive results in some ways. As you're probably aware, the kina's gone up against the dollar quite substantially in the last few months. But at the same time, the forecasts are that major industries are under threat. I've just been surfing that, looking at a few major companies in the region who are now talking about closing down operations, or not expanding, or not going ahead. I think we're still coming to terms with it, and I think it's going to be very difficult, as I say, for the reasons I gave in the first place, to be confident that we really understand what's going on.
Yes, Mark.
Just to add to that, specifically the effect on remittances of the global crisis. Traditionally, remittances have a bit of resiliency built into them because of the very nature of sending money back to family members. And given the fact that the sender knows the person receiving, it's many times there's sort of a resiliency built in where a crisis of medium magnitude wouldn't have that much impact. That said, this crisis is not a medium magnitude crisis from all accounts. And if, what I mentioned earlier, if it starts to bite in the way that countries such as US start deporting more irregular migrants and deporting more workers and putting up the barriers that I mentioned, then the remittances will indeed, there will be an impact. From what I've read right now, I think whether it's World Bank or ILO estimates, an estimate I've seen out there is expecting about a 6% drop in remittances in 2009, but that can be, as I say, can increase depending on how severe this crisis bites.
Judah wants to add words.
Actually, just a footnote to both. To Nick's comment, if you don't mind me just going back to the earlier question, to Nick's comment about attention to recruitment, I just wanted to add what I think is something that could potentially get overlooked and then get the scheme into trouble. With the best of intentions to spread equity, there is a proposal which is always on the table to actually curtail access for about 2 years. Recruit people, let them have a shot at it for a couple of years, then recruit some other people. Generally, that tends to lead to overstaying, because in the second year, then people decide this is their last shot, so let's overstay. So that's really something to balance equity with. On the financial crisis and the impact of remittances, I just wanted to say that it's hard to predict, of course. But on the basis of historical data, I'm worried, because whenever and it's impossible to know what the magnitude of the crisis that we're entering is going to be, but in the past, given that Tonga and Samoa, for example, have had remittances coming in for decades, it is possible to look at what happens to remittances when there is a shock in the global system. And they do suffer. And to the extent that the largest remittance sender into the Pacific is actually the US, followed by New Zealand and then Australia. All eyes are on the US, since it is the primary source of remittances. And in the past, it has gone down. It's recovered as well. Conversely, when there is a crisis in the Pacific, remittances tend to actually overcompensate. So they are counter-cyclical. People do tend to send even more money home when there is an adverse shock at home. The question is, how will they deal with it when they themselves are at